Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you appreciate your memory foam mattress and blackout curtains in ways you never imagined. We're talking about the truly bizarre, deeply uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying sleep habits of medieval people. And I'm not just talking about the lack of central heating or electric blankets. Though trust me, that's the least of their problems. Imagine sleeping in a bed you share with your entire family, possibly a few farm animals, and a thriving colony of fleas that consider your body their personal buffet. Picture waking up in the middle of the night not because you need to check your phone, but because that's just what everyone did back then. By design, medieval sleep was a whole different universe of weird, and you probably won't survive this mentally unscathed once you realize how much worse it could be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing there's someone in Tokyo drifting off at 3 a.m. while someone in Ohio is using this to survive their night shift. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a medieval village somewhere in England, let's say around the year 1300. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, and already the temperature is plummeting. There's no thermostat to adjust, no heated blanket to plug in. The darkness is absolute in a way modern people simply don't experience. No streetlights, no glowing phone screens, no LED clock casting that faint blue glow across your bedroom. When the sun goes down in medieval times, the world transforms into an ocean of darkness punctuated only by flickering candles and the occasional torch, both of which are far too expensive for peasants to waste on something as frivolous as reading in bed. You make your way toward your home, which is generous to call it that. It's more like a one-room structure with walls made of wattle and daub, basically sticks woven together and plastered with mud, dung, and straw. Architectural Digest is not calling. The floor is hard-packed earth, maybe scattered with rushes if you're doing well for yourself. There's a central fire pit that fills the room with smoke because chimneys haven't become standard yet, and your eyes water constantly, but that smoke serves a purpose beyond cooking. It keeps some of the insects at bay and preserves the thatched roof. Not all the insects, mind you, not even most of them, just some. In the corner of this single room sits the family bed. And when I say family bed, I mean family bed. This isn't a king-sized luxury where everyone gets their own space. This is a wooden frame, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet if you're prosperous, strung with rope in a crosshatch pattern to support the mattress. That mattress, and I'm using the term loosely here, is a large fabric sack stuffed with straw, and if you're lucky, maybe some feathers from the chickens you keep. The whole thing sits maybe a foot off the ground, raised just enough to keep you slightly away from the coldest air that settles on the floor, and to give the rats a nice place to nest underneath. You're welcome, rats. This bed is where you sleep alongside your spouse, your 4 children, possibly your elderly parent, and occasionally a valued farm animal if the weather gets particularly brutal. Historians estimate that medieval peasant families routinely had 5 to 8 people sharing a single sleeping surface. Privacy is not a medieval concept. Personal space is a luxury invented centuries later by people who had more than one room. You pile in together, not just for emotional comfort, but for survival. Body heat is the only reliable heating system you've got. And on a January night, when frost coats the inside of your walls, you're grateful for your brother's bony elbow digging into your ribs, because at least it's warm. The smell, if we're being honest, is probably somewhere between rustic barn and biological warfare. Nobody is showering daily. In fact, full-body bathing is viewed with suspicion by many medieval people who believe that water opens your pores and lets diseases sneak in. You might wash your hands and face semi-regularly, but a full bath? That's a maybe once a month situation if you're fastidious, and more like a few times a year reality for most folks. Add in the fact that your bed is home to fleas, lice, bedbugs, and various other parasites, plus whatever your farm animals bring in on the cold nights they join you. And you've got an aromatic situation that would make a modern germaphobe faint on the spot. But here's the thing, you don't know any different. This is just life. You climb into that bed, wedge yourself between your snoring father and your restless 8-year-old. Pull the shared woolen blanket up over your shoulders, assuming your siblings haven't already stolen most of it, and prepare for a night of sleep that would look absolutely nothing like the 8 uninterrupted hours we modern folks aim for. Because medieval sleep isn't one continuous block of unconsciousness. Oh no. It's something far stranger, something that anthropologists and sleep scientists are still trying to fully understand. Your body is about to do something that our ancestors considered completely normal, but that would probably get you sent to a doctor today. You close your eyes as the last ember in the fire pit fades to a dull glow. Somewhere in the distance, you hear a dog barking, a baby crying in a neighboring house, and the sound of the night watch calling out that all is well in the village. Your breathing slows, your muscles relax despite the lumpy straw beneath you, and the elbow now firmly planted in your kidney, and you drift off into your first sleep of the night. Not your only sleep, your first sleep. Your eyes open in the darkness, not because of a nightmare, not because you need to use the chamber pot, not because your neighbor's rooster has a broken internal clock. You wake up simply because this is what humans did for thousands of years, and your medieval body knows the drill. You've been asleep for about 3 or 4 hours, what people in your time call first sleep or first nap, and now you're entering the interval, that strange middle of the night waking period that's as routine as breakfast. This isn't insomnia. This is architecture. This is how sleep was structured before electric lights rewired our brains and convinced us that 8 consecutive hours of unconsciousness is the natural order of things. Historians still argue whether this biphasic sleep pattern was truly universal or more common in certain regions and classes, but the evidence keeps piling up. from all corners of medieval Europe. Court documents mention people stirring during first sleep and then returning to second sleep. Prayer manuals give specific devotions for the middle of the night. Medical texts discuss what to do during the waking hours between sleeps. This wasn't an anomaly. This was the system. You lie there in the darkness, and you're not alone in being awake. Next to you, your wife has also stirred, and you can hear her breathing change from the deep rhythm of sleep to something more alert. Across the room, well, across the same bed, really, one of your children shifts and mumbles something unintelligible before settling back down. They're young enough that they'll sleep straight through sometimes, but you remember when you were their age. You'd wake between sleeps just like the adults. So what do you do with this hour or two of darkness-soaked wakefulness? You don't have a phone to scroll through. You don't have a book and enough light to read it by. Candles and lamp oil are expensive, and you're not wasting them on recreational nighttime activities. You can't exactly flip on the TV and catch up on your favorite show. Instead, you do what medieval people did. You exist in the quiet. You think, you pray, you talk in whispers with whoever else is awake, and sometimes, wink wink, you engage in certain marital activities that historical sources delicately refer to as the preferred time for procreation, because everyone's relaxed and the children are genuinely asleep for once. The medieval church had opinions about this interval time, naturally, because the medieval church had opinions about everything. Several religious texts encouraged people to use these waking hours for prayer and contemplation. There were specific prayers designed for this middle of the night devotional time, asking God for protection until morning and reflecting on mortality, because nothing says relaxing interval between sleeps like contemplating your inevitable death and the eternal fate of your immortal soul. But for the devout, and in medieval Europe, that's most people to at least some degree. This made the interval feel purposeful rather than just empty waiting time. Some people would actually get out of bed during this interval. They'd tend to the fire if it needed stoking, check on livestock, maybe have a small snack if food wasn't too scarce. The wealthy might use this time to discuss household matters with their spouse, plan the next day's activities, or even receive visitors if something urgent had come up. The very poor might use it to do a bit of work they couldn't fit into daylight hours, mending clothes by dim firelight, for instance, or preparing dough for the next day's bread. There's something almost meditative about this interval that we've completely lost in our modern sleep through the night culture. Your mind during this time is in a unique state, not fully alert like during the day, but not unconscious like in sleep. It's a liminal space, a threshold consciousness where thoughts drift in interesting directions. You might solve a problem that's been nagging you. You might remember a dream from your first sleep with unusual clarity and spend time puzzling over what it means. And trust me, dream interpretation is a whole thing in medieval culture, but we'll get to that later. You might simply lie there feeling the warmth of your family around you, listening to the night sounds of the village, and experiencing a kind of peace that our overstimulated modern minds rarely access. Historians still argue whether artificial lighting gradually killed off this sleep pattern or whether it was more complicated than that, involving changes in work schedules, industrialization, and cultural shifts around productivity. But by the time the 20th century rolls around, biphasic sleep has been almost entirely replaced by the consolidated 8-hour model, and anyone who wakes up in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep immediately gets diagnosed with middle insomnia and handed a prescription. You, however, lying in your medieval bed with straw poking through the fabric into your back, don't have insomnia. You have a completely normal sleep cycle that happens to include this peaceful, dark interval. After about an hour, maybe 90 minutes, you feel the drowsiness returning. It creeps over you like a soft blanket, heavier and more insistent than the actual scratchy woolen blanket you're sharing with 6 other people. Your thoughts start to fragment and drift. The line between awake and asleep blurs. Your wife has already drifted back under. You can tell by her breathing. One by one, the other family members who had been awake during the interval also return to sleep. And finally, you do too, slipping into what everyone simply calls second sleep or morning sleep, which will carry you through until dawn, when the roosters and church bells drag everyone back to consciousness, and the brutal work of medieval subsistence farming begins anew. This second sleep is often reported as being deeper, more dream-filled, more restorative than the first. It's the sleep that prepares you for the physical demands of the day ahead, and those demands are intense. Medieval peasant life is unrelenting physical labor from sunup to sundown during the growing season. You'll need every minute of that second sleep to repair your muscles, process the meager calories you managed to consume, and reset your mind for another day of surviving in a world that's actively trying to kill you through famine, disease, exposure, or any number of colorful medieval dangers. But for now, you're deeply unconscious, dreaming of things you won't quite remember come morning, your body finally still among the tangle of family members and the ever-present company of fleas who, unlike you, don't take a break between first and second sleep. They're working the night shift, and business is good. When you finally wake from second sleep, your first sensation is cold. Not the kind of cold where you reach over and adjust the thermostat, but the kind that's infiltrated the room so thoroughly that your breath comes out in visible puffs, even inside your own home. It's late autumn, and the temperature inside is barely different from the temperature outside, because insulation is not exactly a medieval strong suit. Your house is essentially a thin membrane separating you from the elements, offering protection from wind and rain, but doing very little about the cold itself. You're acutely aware of what you're wearing, or more accurately, what you're not wearing. Because here's where medieval sleep habits get really interesting, and where social class creates wildly different experiences. If you're a peasant, which statistically you probably are, since roughly 90% of medieval Europeans fell into this category, you have some decisions to make about nighttime attire, and those decisions are largely dictated by how many clothes you actually own. For the truly poor, The answer is simple. You sleep in whatever you were wearing during the day, possibly minus your outer layer if it's wet or too filthy, even by medieval standards. That means you're sleeping in your basic tunic or shift, maybe some hose or leg wrappings if you're male. And that's it. You don't change into special sleeping clothes because you don't have special sleeping clothes. You own maybe 2 or 3 garments total, and the idea of dedicating one exclusively to sleep is laughable when you're one bad harvest away from starvation. The clothes you sleep in are the clothes you work in, eat in, and occasionally die in. Medieval capsule wardrobe at its finest. But here's where it gets weirder. Some people sleep completely naked. Now, before you picture some kind of medieval nudist colony, understand that this isn't about comfort or freedom. It's about practicality. If you only own one set of clothes, and they get wet during the day, you're not sleeping in damp fabric in a freezing house. That's a fast track to illness and death. So you strip down, hang your clothes near the fire or over a rafter to dry, and huddle naked under whatever blankets or furs you possess, using your family members' body heat as your heating system. The church had mixed feelings about this. Some religious authorities argued that naked sleeping was natural and innocent, especially between married couples. Others worried it led to temptation and sin. Historians still argue whether naked sleeping was more common in summer months or practiced year-round in certain regions. If you're slightly better off, a prosperous peasant, a tradesperson, a merchant, you might own what's basically a medieval nightgown, though nobody called it that. It was just a longer, looser linen shirt or shift that you'd change into for sleeping. Linen was the fabric of choice because it was washable and could be kept relatively clean, which mattered when you were sleeping in close quarters with multiple people. This garment would be one of your most valued possessions, washed more frequently than your day clothes because it spent 8 to 10 hours pressed against your skin every single night. The wealthy, of course, operated on an entirely different plane of existence. If you're nobility, you're sleeping in specially made night clothes of fine linen or even silk if you're really showing off. These garments might be embroidered, dyed in expensive colors, and cut in styles that signified your status even in sleep. You might have multiple sleeping garments and change them regularly. You probably have a servant whose job includes managing your wardrobe, and that includes your nighttime attire. Some nobles even wore sleeping caps, elaborate affairs designed to keep your head warm, and, for women, to protect complex hairstyles that took hours to arrange and weren't being redone every single day. But here's something that cuts across all social classes. People wore more to bed in summer and less in winter, which seems backward until you think about it. In summer, you'd keep your clothes on for modesty and to protect against insect bites. And there were a lot of insects, mosquitoes, bedbugs, fleas, gnats, all manner of things that wanted to feast on exposed skin. Your clothing acted as a barrier, however imperfect. In winter, when insects were less active and cold was the main enemy, you might strip down more because you needed every bit of body heat you could generate. and clothes actually created slight barriers between your skin and your family member's skin, reducing the efficiency of your human heating pile. Children, by the way, often slept naked or nearly naked regardless of season, wrapped in whatever fabrics were available. Partly this was because children grow fast, and allocating resources to clothes they'd outgrow in months was wasteful. Partly it was because children's bodies run hot anyway, and they served as excellent heat sources for the adults around them. Medieval parents absolutely used their children as biological space heaters, and nobody thought twice about it. There's also the question of what you did with your clothes when you weren't wearing them. If you're poor, they're probably piled on top of you as extra blankets or hung from a peg on the wall. If you're wealthy, they're carefully folded and stored in a chest, possibly with herbs to keep moths away. The very wealthy might have special furniture called ambries or wardrobes where clothes were hung, early versions of the closet, basically. But for most people, clothes management was simple because you didn't have enough clothes for it to be complicated. One particularly weird practice was the tendency to sleep with your head covered, regardless of what the rest of your body was wearing. Sleeping caps, head wraps, coifs, these were common across social classes. Partly, this was practical. You lose a huge amount of body heat through your head, and keeping it covered helped you stay warm. But there was also a belief that night air was dangerous, that cold air entering your body through your head while you slept could cause illness or bad dreams. Medical texts warned against sleeping with your head uncovered, especially during certain seasons or moon phases. So you'd have people sleeping totally naked except for an elaborate head covering, which must have looked absolutely ridiculous, but made perfect sense in the medieval medical framework. Women had additional considerations. Long hair was often braided for sleep to prevent tangling and to make morning grooming easier. These braids might be wrapped around the head or tucked into a cap. Loose hair during sleep was sometimes associated with moral looseness, at least in certain time periods and regions, though this varied considerably. Unmarried women might sleep with loose hair, while married women kept theirs covered and bound, visual markers of status that persisted even in the privacy of the bedroom. You're just settling back into the warmth of your family pile, trying to steal a few more minutes of rest before the demands of the day begin, when suddenly a sound pierces the pre-dawn darkness. It's a bell, not a gentle alarm clock chime or a pleasant phone alert. This is a massive bronze bell being swung with enthusiastic force by someone in a tower, and the sound waves are practically attacking your eardrums. Welcome to the medieval alarm system, courtesy of the Catholic Church and their absolutely relentless schedule of prayer times. If you live anywhere near a monastery, cathedral, or even a modest parish church, which is basically everyone in medieval Europe, your sleep schedule isn't really yours. It belongs to the church, specifically to the horarium, the rigid schedule of prayer services that punctuates every 24-hour period. These bells aren't ringing because someone wants to gently suggest you might think about waking up. They're ringing because God requires worship at specific intervals, and everyone within earshot is going to know about it whether they like it or not. The monks themselves have it worst. Their schedule is absolutely punishing by modern standards. They're up for matins in the dead of night. We're talking 2 or 3 a.m., right in the middle of what would be that peaceful interval between first and second sleep for everyone else. Then comes lauds at dawn, prime at 6 a.m., terce at 9 a.m., sext at noon, none at 3 p.m., vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. That's 8 prayer services per day, and each one is announced with bells that can be heard for miles. Historians still argue whether monks actually maintained this brutal schedule year-round, or if there was more flexibility in practice than the rule of Saint Benedict technically allowed. But the bells rang regardless. For the peasants and townspeople living in the bell's radius, this creates a fascinating situation. You don't own a clock. Almost nobody does. Mechanical clocks exist by the later medieval period, but they're rare, expensive, and not exactly reliable. Sundials work great until the sun goes down or clouds roll in. Water clocks are finicky, so how do you know what time it is? You listen for the bells. The church bells become the community shared timekeeper, dividing the day into segments that everyone recognizes. When the terce bell rings, you know it's mid-morning. When vespers sounds, you know to start wrapping up your work. The bells create a collective temporal framework that organizes medieval life, but they also absolutely destroy any concept of sleeping in. That lauds bell at dawn isn't a suggestion. It's a declaration that the night is over and God's work begins now. If you're a peasant farmer, you're probably getting up around this time anyway, because you need every hour of daylight to work your fields, tend your animals, and complete the endless tasks that subsistence farming requires. But if you're sick, exhausted, or just had a terrible night of sleep thanks to a colicky baby or a sick family member, too bad. The bell doesn't care about your personal circumstances. The bell rings, and the day begins. Some people love this system. It provided structure, predictability, and a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. Every time that bell rang, you knew that monks were praying for your soul, for your village, for the whole Christian community. There was comfort in that, a feeling that you were part of a vast spiritual network united by these shared moments of divine attention, even if you weren't personally stopping to pray at each bell. And let's be real, most people weren't. Knowing that someone was praying created a sense of security in an insecure world. Other people probably wanted to throw things at the bell tower. Imagine you're a baker who's been up since 2 a.m. kneading dough, and you finally lie down for a quick rest around 8 a.m. And then the terce bell starts clanging. Or you're a night watchman who just finished your shift and desperately needs sleep. But every few hours, another bell announces another service. Or you're trying to comfort a feverish child, and the bells keep startling them awake. The bells were democratic in the worst way. They disrupted everyone equally regardless of need or circumstance. There were also secular bells that governed urban life in towns and cities. These announced market opening and closing times, curfews, fire alarms, and public emergencies. In larger towns, you might have multiple bell towers, all ringing at different times for different purposes, creating a complex acoustic landscape that residents learned to decode. That's the market bell. That's the watch bell. That's the alarm bell, meaning something's on fire or someone's attacking. Your ears became sophisticated instruments for interpreting bells, and you could probably identify which building a bell was coming from based on its tone and rhythm. The effect on sleep patterns was profound. Medieval people didn't fight against these interruptions the way we might. They incorporated them into their rest. You'd hear the matins bell in the middle of the night, maybe register it semi-consciously during your interval between sleeps, and either drift back under or use it as a trigger to say a quick prayer before returning to second sleep. The bells became part of the soundscape of rest, as familiar as your spouse's snoring or the sound of mice in the walls. Interestingly, the bells also created a kind of temporal equity. A noble in his manor and a peasant in his hovel heard the same bells at the same time. Time became democratized in a way that was rare in medieval society's rigid hierarchy. Everyone from the king to the lowest serf knew when vespers rang, when none sounded. You couldn't buy your way out of the bells or exempt yourself from their reach. They were one of the few genuinely equalizing forces in a deeply unequal world. Of course, if you lived far from any church, your experience was different. Rural hermits, people in isolated farmsteads, folks living in regions not yet fully Christianized. They operated on natural rhythms of light and dark, season and weather, without the constant punctuation of bells. Historians note that these people often maintained even more pronounced biphasic sleep patterns and operated on schedules that seem almost alien to both medieval church time and modern clock time. You drag yourself out of bed, your bare feet hitting the cold earthen floor, and immediately you're aware of things moving in the mattress behind you. Not your family members. They're still mostly asleep or pretending to be. I'm talking about the other inhabitants of your bed. The fleas, the bedbugs, the lice, and whatever other multi-legged squatters have taken up residence in your sleeping arrangements. Welcome to perhaps the most viscerally disturbing aspect of medieval sleep, the fact that you were never, ever alone in bed, and most of your bedmates had 6 or 8 legs. Let's talk about your mattress, and I use that term generously. What you're sleeping on is basically a large fabric tick, a tough cloth bag, stuffed with whatever filling material you could acquire. If you're a standard peasant, that's straw, just regular straw from wheat or rye, the same stuff you'd feed to animals or scatter on the floor. You stuff as much of it as you can into this bag, sew or tie it shut, and congratulations, you've made a medieval mattress. The problem is that straw breaks down. It compresses. It gets damp from body moisture and the general humidity of your inadequately sealed house. It develops musty smells. And most critically, it becomes an apartment complex for insects. Fleas absolutely thrive in straw mattresses. They lay their eggs in the straw. Their larvae feed on the organic debris that accumulates in there. Dead skin cells, bits of food that fell into the bed, whatever else ends up in a medieval mattress. And then adult fleas emerge to feed on you all night long. You're basically sleeping on a flea farm, and you're the crop. Medieval people were so accustomed to flea bites that they barely registered them anymore. You'd wake up with new bites every morning, scratch absently at them throughout the day, and think nothing of it because literally everyone you knew had the same experience. The recommended maintenance schedule for these mattresses was to empty them and refill them with fresh straw once a year, typically in late summer or early autumn after the harvest, when fresh straw was plentiful. This annual refreshing was a big deal, almost a household ritual. You'd drag the tick outside, dump the old straw, which by this point was a compressed, possibly moldy, definitely insect-infested mat of decomposed plant matter, onto the midden heap or into the garden as mulch. Then you'd wash the fabric, if you were fastidious, let it dry in the sun, and refill it with clean, fresh straw. For about a week, your bed would be almost pleasant. Then the insects would start moving back in, and by winter you'd be back to status quo. If you were better off, you might have some feathers mixed into your straw, either from domestic chickens and geese or from wild birds. Feathers provided better cushioning and retained heat nicely, but they also created new problems. Feathers could poke through the fabric and stab you in the night. They clumped up and needed to be regularly fluffed and redistributed, and they were even more attractive to certain parasites than straw was. Historians still argue whether feather beds were actually more comfortable or just more prestigious, a way of displaying wealth rather than genuinely improving sleep quality. The truly wealthy had mattresses stuffed entirely with down, the soft under feathers of waterfowl, and these were luxury items worth substantial money. A good down mattress might be listed in a will and passed down through generations. These still had insects, mind you, because medieval buildings just had insects everywhere. But at least the mattress itself was softer, and the down could be washed and re-fluffed periodically. Some nobles had multiple mattresses layered on top of each other, creating elaborate sleeping platforms that were as much about status display as comfort. But let's get back to the bugs, because they deserve their own spotlight in this nightmare. Bedbugs were ubiquitous. These flat, oval, reddish-brown insects would hide in the bed frame, in the ropes that held the mattress, in the cracks of the walls near the bed, and in the mattress itself. They'd emerge at night, drawn by your body heat and the carbon dioxide you exhaled, and they'd feed on your blood for 5 to 10 minutes before retreating. Their bites often arranged themselves in lines or clusters, and they itched intensely. Medieval people called them wall lice or bed lice and accepted them as an inevitable part of life. There were folk remedies, of course. Some people would periodically take their bed frames outside and pour boiling water over them, hoping to kill the bugs and their eggs. Others would spread certain herbs, rue, pennyroyal, mugwort, in and around the bed, believing they repelled insects. Some folks advocated rubbing the bed frame with garlic or onions. Did any of this work? Maybe marginally, temporarily, but the bugs always came back because they were everywhere in the environment. Every house had them. Every inn had them. Every monastery, every castle, every hovel. Bedbugs were medieval life, and you just had to cope. Lice were the other major passenger on your medieval sleeping journey. Body lice lived in your clothes and bedding. Head lice colonized your hair, and pubic lice set up shop in coarser body hair. They'd move from person to person through the shared sleeping arrangements, spreading democratically through families and communities. Delicing, picking lice and their eggs out of hair and clothing was a regular social activity. You'd sit with family members and methodically search through each other's hair, crushing lice between your fingernails with a satisfying pop. It was bonding time, actually, similar to grooming behaviors in primate communities. You'd chat, share gossip, strengthen social bonds, all while conducting pest control. The really disturbing part is that these weren't just annoying. They were vectors for serious diseases. Fleas carried plague. Yes, that plague, the Black Death that killed a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. The bacteria Yersinia pestis lived in flea guts and transmitted to humans through flea bites or through contact with flea feces. Every flea in your bed was a potential delivery system for an agonizing death. Body lice transmitted typhus, a bacterial infection that caused high fevers, horrible rashes, and frequently death. Sleeping in a bug-infested bed wasn't just uncomfortable. It was genuinely dangerous. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory or disease vectors, so they didn't connect the dots between their flea infestations and plague outbreaks. They had theories about bad air, divine punishment, and astrological influences, but the idea that the tiny insects sharing their beds were actually killing them en masse would have seemed absurd. You finally extracted yourself from the bed and its menagerie of insect life, and now you're standing in the cold morning air, trying to wake up fully. But here's where medieval sleep habits take another bizarre turn that would send modern doctors into fits of alarm. The position you slept in wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival. Or at least, that's what medieval medical theory insisted. Because lying flat on your back like a normal person, that could literally kill you, according to the medical wisdom of the time. Medieval medicine was dominated by the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These bodily fluids needed to remain in careful balance for health, and everything you did, including how you slept, could upset that balance with potentially fatal consequences. The medical texts of the period, drawing heavily on ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Galen and Hippocrates, were very specific about proper sleeping positions, and their reasoning was delightfully weird by modern standards. The prevailing medical opinion was that you should sleep on your right side, at least initially. The logic went something like this. Your stomach was believed to be on the left side of your body, so lying on your right side would allow your stomach to rest on top of your liver, facilitating digestion during sleep. Food would properly cook in your stomach thanks to the body's internal heat, and the nutrients would be correctly processed into blood. Starting the night on your left side was considered dangerous because it would compress your stomach and interfere with digestion, potentially causing the food to rot inside you rather than being properly transformed. And rotting food in your stomach meant putrid vapors rising to your brain, which could cause illness, bad dreams, or even death. Later in the night, you were supposed to shift to your left side to allow your liver to drain properly and prevent blood from pooling in dangerous ways. It was all very specific and all completely wrong from a modern medical perspective, but medieval people took this stuff seriously. Medical handbooks written for lay people included detailed instructions about sleep positions, and wealthy families would have been educated about proper sleeping posture as part of their general health regimen. But the real terror was sleeping flat on your back. This position was considered genuinely dangerous because it supposedly allowed bad humors to flow directly to your brain. With nothing to block their upward movement, these fluids and vapors could overwhelm your mental faculties, cause nightmares, induce suffocation, or even result in sudden death. The medical term for dying in your sleep was nocturnal suffocation, and one of the suspected causes was sleeping supine and allowing phlegm or other humors to literally drown you from the inside. Historians still argue whether this medieval concern about back sleeping had any basis in observation. Perhaps people with sleep apnea or other breathing disorders did fare worse on their backs, or if it was purely theoretical. Some people took this advice to extremes and slept sitting partially upright, not completely vertical like you're in a chair, but propped at a significant angle using multiple pillows, rolled up blankets, or specially constructed wedges. This was especially common among the elderly, who were considered particularly vulnerable to humor imbalances, and among people who suffered from what we now call respiratory issues. If you had chronic coughing, chest congestion, or breathing difficulties, sleeping upright or semi-upright was the prescribed remedy. No medieval doctor was prescribing inhalers or antibiotics. They were telling you to stack up some pillows and hope gravity kept the bad stuff from pooling in your lungs. The wealthy had elaborate sleeping arrangements that facilitated this upright sleeping. Some beds were designed with raised head sections, almost like modern adjustable beds, but achieved through wooden construction rather than motors. Nobles might have multiple cushions and bolsters specifically for creating sleeping angles. There are inventory records from wealthy households listing numerous pillows of different sizes and firmness levels, suggesting that creating the proper sleeping geometry was a significant concern. Peasants, lacking such resources, got creative. You might roll up your extra clothing to create a wedge. You might position yourself against the wall at an angle. You might use a log or a large stone wrapped in fabric. The goal was to keep your head and torso elevated enough that those murderous humors couldn't flow upward and kill you in your sleep. It probably made for an uncomfortable night, but it was better than death, or so the theory went. Pregnant women received special sleeping position instructions that were even more elaborate. They were supposed to sleep on their left side specifically, despite the general advice against this, because it was believed to prevent the baby from being crushed against the liver. Later in pregnancy, they might be advised to sleep partially upright to prevent the weight of the baby from causing other organs to malfunction. The fact that women had been successfully giving birth for millennia before these detailed instructions existed seemed not to trouble the male physicians writing these guides. There were also seasonal sleeping position recommendations. In summer, you might sleep on your back briefly because the heat would supposedly dry up excess moisture and reduce the danger of humoral imbalance. In winter, side sleeping was even more critical because cold was believed to increase moisture in the body, making humor pooling more dangerous. Spring and autumn had their own specific considerations based on which humors were thought to be ascendant during those seasons. Children were generally exempt from these elaborate rules, partly because children were considered to have naturally balanced humors that didn't require as much maintenance. They could flop around in whatever position felt comfortable without medical intervention, though nurses and mothers were still advised to position infants carefully to prevent suffocation from bedding or from accidentally being rolled upon by adults sharing the sleeping space. Some religious orders incorporated specific sleeping positions into their rules of discipline. Certain monks were required to sleep on their backs as a form of mortification of the flesh, deliberately courting the discomfort and supposed danger as a way of demonstrating their faith and acceptance of God's will. Others were mandated to sleep sitting upright to facilitate faster rising for midnight prayers. The sleeping body became another arena for demonstrating religious devotion and self-control. The anxiety around sleeping positions reveals something deeper about medieval attitudes toward the body and death. Sleep itself was considered a kind of temporary death, a state of vulnerability where the soul loosened its grip on the body and demonic forces might gain entry. Controlling your sleeping position was one way of maintaining some agency during this dangerous nightly surrender to unconsciousness.